All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Crypto 101 podcast. And up front, pardon me if you guys notice any rust on my game. I'm shaking off some rust. I'm off a 6-week paternity leave.
Nice.
So, this is my first episode.
Congratulations.
You can see I got the dad mug here.
Excellent.
So I'm really excited to come back to this. Brendan, we've got some legends in the space. Abhay and Scott from Helium. They're joining us today. And these are just, I don't know how else to say it, just legends in the space. They've been building Helium for a long, long time. Very smart, very hardworking, and really, I think, kind of in their own respect, really leaders to the entire DPIN movement. And so we're going to be talking about the DPIN movement from a high level, talk about Helium, some specifics. But for everybody who hasn't met Abhay and Scott from Helium, welcome, Scott, Abhay. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing well. How are you
Great,
doing?
thanks
How's the sleep? Like,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
dad?
No, I'm
Baby Vegas.
I'm ready to rock. No, you guys have been kicking ass. I mean, anybody who's in crypto right now has certainly heard about Helium. Brendan, how are you doing, man? You're feeling good? Feeling ready to rock?
Feeling fantastic. We're prepping for the ever continuing surge of hurricanes here in Florida. So it's just one after another.
Oh, you were in the eye of the storm.
We are, but
shit.
The decentralized markets never stop. And what doesn't kill them makes them stronger. And so here we are, getting an awesome episode with leaders in the space. We're welcomed back by Bryce 2.0, a new man.
So
and what better episode?
So much perspective and wisdom I've gained in the past 6 weeks of looking into the eyes of my son. No. All right, enough banter, enough jokes. Can we just get an introduction from both of you gentlemen? Whoever wants to go first, just tell us a little bit about your background and why particularly you both are the perfect team to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I'll get started. So I'm Abhay Kumar. I've been working on Helium since 2019, right around the time that we launched our first L1. I started off actually as a hotspot owner. I deployed my first hotspot. I got very active in the community. I built apps. I'm an engineer. I've been working in startups for way too long, and maybe not long enough at the same time. I saw problems that I wanted to solve, and I started building in the ecosystem. And at some point, got annoying enough that I joined the core team and started building them directly. So I've done everything from working on the original L1, moving the original L1 from hotspots to validators, to staked validators, moving us from those staked validators to Solana, and I continue to work on the core protocol. I work on this stuff because I think connectivity is like way on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. I think it's something that everyone needs. And I think that the way that we have been building networks is both sort of complementary and, ideally is something that is really, really incentive aligned to the way networks should be built in the future. So that's why I work on this stuff. And yeah, Scott, you want to take it?
Yeah, I think something Abhay and I certainly share about kind of connectivity, that like basic, it's basic human need, basic human right at this point, and why it's so exciting and so important to be working on these things. And, we talk about open and permissionless networks and crypto in general, all these things come back to, well, how are you actually able to connect and how can you kind of stand up that type of connectivity yourself? But yeah, I mean, similarly, come from a couple decades, working in ventures, scaling up traditional Web 2 companies and kind of fintech and consumer space, with an accidental stint over on the capital side for a short bit. And Bitcoin was actually the thing that got me in the first place of, very technical team back when exchanges were getting hacked in the, 2016, 2017. How do you think about solving for that counterparty risk? And, got to go over to scaling Bitcoin a couple times and, one of the only non-engineers in the room, but, I think, always enjoyed translating from a highly technical audience and the kind of how you think about building up communities, getting more people, increasing involvement and participation. So the background mostly in kind of BD ops and kind of scaling from a growth perspective of how do you think about getting more folks involved. And I think that's where it's always been exciting with Helium is how much Helium really kind of expands the pie for participation when you think about where the network started and that ability for anybody to get involved in kind of putting up a radio. I know we'll get into that in a moment, but just in general, I've been with Helium now kind of again since I guess was it 2020 or early 2021, kind of sending up what was the foundation and thinking about how we could continue to educate the public, drive forward on engaging with the public sector, building out our community, early instances of our grant program, and creating other incentives for people to help build this network beyond the original core team. So it's really been a fantastic journey, and to see the output of work that we have done both across the IoT and the mobile network has been incredibly rewarding and fulfilling, and excited about the next several years to come.
Yeah. And I know we're going to talk a lot about those, but for all the listeners out there, you're going to hear us say a couple of different pieces of jargon here in the crypto space. And one of the big ones is going to be the word DPIN. And if you don't know what DPIN is, I want to make sure that we kind of dive into this right now and get a proper introduction to it, because it's a space that is growing really fast here in crypto. And it's exploded onto the scene as blockchain technology has continued to advance. And there's so many different applications about how DPIN, or decentralized physical infrastructure, can be used. But gentlemen, I kind of want to open up the floor here and let both of you introduce not only what DPIN is at a high level, but also how you all are specifically using DPIN.
And real quick, I also want to layer the question here with just a simple, whose nightmare is DPIN? In the same way that DeFi is the nightmare of the big banks, DPIN is the nightmare of blank. Anyhow, go for it.
So I actually I would push back on what came first, Helium or DPIN, because I mean, in terms of how you think about what is DPIN? This idea of first of all, I think it's probably the killer case for crypto beyond Bitcoin itself as a store of value. Of how do you coordinate that work in the physical world? How do you think about physical footprints, whether that is around wireless, around energy, edge compute, whatnot? But let's look at the problem that Helium is solving for an industry like wireless. It has always been an infrastructure model that was top down, high capex, where you had a very small number of players spending billions every single year to own the real estate, pay the operator, put up radios, and it was very siloed. So if you think about these kind of largest social issues of closing the digital divide and ensuring coverage for all, internet access for all, to only have a top-down model where how do you think about that local relevancy and context of where a small business or a farm might need that connectivity, where a residential household that doesn't have sufficient connectivity, they know where they need that connectivity the best. So you have to have these types of systems that can be built from the ground up. Obviously, Helium is focused on the wireless space, but for some of the areas within DPIN, how do you better manage a power grid? Again, a lot of these areas kind of have that local context that's required. So to have that agency, to have the incentive to build networks from the ground up in a way that is economically sustainable, that's really how I think you can think about DPIN. And again, for us, it's mostly on the physical location matters. Mm-hmm. There are certainly areas of DPIN where it's a little bit less of the physical, more of the virtual. But I think for us, the physical is kind of where we see a lot of that inherent value in that network effect really playing out, because wireless coverage matters by geography. So that, to me, I think is the value of DPIN. You asked that question of who's it a nightmare for? I actually, in the case of wireless specifically, to me, it's tide raising all boats. These large carriers are actually reducing their spend on some of these areas of infrastructure. So the idea that they can solve for their connectivity through roaming. So, you're in an airport, you're not necessarily on Verizon or AT&T's, radios in their infrastructure. You're roaming into somebody else's coverage. Think of the Boingos and the Go-Go's, where they might own the coverage in the area. This idea of community-built wireless is not necessarily that novel. It's just introducing an incentive where you can open up that participation so much more broadly that you're benefiting incumbent carriers, but you're also creating the space for new challengers like Helium Mobile to provide a better product and a better service. But really with DPIN, it can benefit everybody as you're marrying a top-down model with something that's bottoms up.
And what I think that this really does is it goes back to the core of blockchain technology, which is removing the middleman. And that's where DPIN comes in. It's remove the middleman from internet, remove the middleman from cellular data, remove the middleman, as we've seen, from decentralized computing, remove the middleman from maybe something like mapping, like we've seen with Hive Mapper. And the list continues to grow. Eventually people are saying, hey, remove the middleman from something like Uber, or remove the middleman from fill in the blank. And there's so many options and there's so many companies that could still be created from this overall idea of DPIN, but it all goes back to the idea of basic blockchain principles, which is removing the middleman. And so that's what gives it, in my opinion, so much potential for growth, because if we can do that, then there's going to be ways to cut back on money and costs. And that means that both parties are, both the spending and receiving, are going to get a better end of the deal if they're cutting out the profits from the middleman.
And so in this scenario, though, who is the middleman exactly? Is it the actual infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of AT&T's wires, like all throughout the ground and the sky and the cell towers and all that kind of stuff? Or is the competitor, I don't know, somebody else? Who is the middleman?
I don't, I'll take the other side of this. I don't think it's about removing a middleman. I think it's about increasing participation, right? There's this that I worked in fintech for many years. So I feel somewhat like qualified to talk about this when, yesterday, Austin at Solana said something like, DeFi, effectively implying that DeFi is not about banking the underbanked, but it's about unbanking the folks that are currently banked. And I think he's wrong. And I said that directly to him on Twitter. Like, it was, I think it is about banking the underbanked in a way that I think that everybody is underbanked. Right. I think that not everyone is an active participant in the financial system. I think there's a lot of abstractions out there that sort of reduce their ability to participate in financial systems. And I think things like DeFi are enabling more people at the edges to be an active participant, right? So you as an individual can directly participate in a lending protocol. You're not depositing money in a bank who then lends that money to somebody else. And, you take on this sort of counterparty risk almost automatically. That's what we've seen with some of the, the bank failures recently, where it's like the individuals are the ones that are suffering from the counterparty failures that come out of that lending activity. So I think, with physical infrastructure networks, it's about increasing participation at the edges, right? Me as an individual, I can put up a tower and I'm able to participate in this ecosystem of connectivity. And yes, there is something connecting to me, right? It might be a Starlink satellite that I'm using for my backhaul. It might be a fiber connection that, from a local provider, or it might be a microwave antenna pointed at, a data center that's nearby, right? Like whatever that is, whatever that backhaul is being provided to me. And I am then redistributing that to a neighborhood or to my customers if I'm a business, and I'm able to actually participate in that economy. And so when you think about who is being disintermediated here, I think it's the bureaucracy of these kinds of centralized networks that is being disintermediated, right? Because I think ultimately, I don't blame Verizon for not putting up a tower in a poor part of town, because their base cost of being able to put up that tower is the same in like the Bayview in San Francisco as it is in Hayes Valley in San Francisco, even though Hayes Valley has way more like opportunity for that. So I don't necessarily blame them. I think they should still do it. I think there should be ways to enable them for doing it. But alternatively, something like Helium can allow a person to stand up a radio for themselves and for their neighbors, as long as they're able to get backhaul to that radio. Right? That's how this stuff should work.
And that backhaul mainly in the future will be coming from satellites. Is that right?
I think it's a mix. I think it should be, I think there are some places where fiber makes a lot of sense, right? When you have a lot of density, I think things like fiber make sense. I think when there's, at least in my neighborhood, for example, it's really hard to run fiber because we don't have telephone poles. Everything has to go underground, so it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. I think I got a quote, this is like 8 years ago now, so I don't know what the cost is these days. But to run fiber to my house, they were going to charge me like 15 grand to do a build.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, cool. I'm going to go figure out a microwave antenna option instead. And I'm part of a local ISP now. Right. And that makes a lot more sense to me, because they're going to go, let's say I did spend that money, which would be insane, but let's say I did,
Mm-hmm.
they would then go to all my neighbors and resell that same fiber line, right? Because that fiber line is not just going to serve me. So I asked a direct question, like, well, how about if me and my neighbors split it? Oh, we don't really work with that way. We can work with you to set this up. It's like, are you going to go resell this? And, of course, no answer.
Wow. I never thought about that. I wonder who in my neighborhood was carrying the load here. Literally, carrying the internet load.
Well, I mean, in some places it just makes sense for them to just run it, right? There are local fiber ISPs in lots of towns that, will just run it because it makes sense to, or it's easy to, or if there are telephone poles in your neighborhood, it's a lot easier to run fiber. That's how Verizon was able to, I grew up on the East Coast. They were able to deploy in the Northeast very, very quickly because they just ran it on the same telephone poles that they already owned.
Mm-hmm. And would you be able to say that Helium is the same speed as fiber, or it could kind of take the similar bandwidth as something similar? Would you say the experience of using Helium is just like anybody who's using a normal internet connection?
Well, so Helium as a cellular product really depends on the radios and the backhaul that's there, right? So if you have a Starlink terminal, you're getting effectively the Starlink speeds on a Wi-Fi, being connected to the Wi-Fi AP.
Okay.
So whatever that is, you'll get it. And each one of these Helium outdoor hotspots, for example, can support 100 to 200 users at a time.
Wow.
Right? Devices at a time, right? And these are carrier class Wi-Fi APs. And your phones can just attach to them as you would if you were in a airport or something like that.
It's crazy how far this kind of technology has come. Because I remember even 10, 20 years ago, it was like, hey, can you stop being on the internet? Can you stop watching TV? Can you stop downloading a movie so that I can browse online for a second?
Yeah.
And you'd have to take turns. And then if you were too far to one side of the house, even if it was 30, 40 feet, it'd be like, oh, I don't have internet connection anymore. And now we have these devices that in a decentralized way can support hundreds of people over a much broader area. And it's so cool to me.
Yeah.
I think that's why now, right? This Helium wouldn't have worked 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, we didn't have all the technology for it, right? The fact that you can download an app, install an eSIM, and immediately be connected to a cellular carrier, Helium Mobile. It's because of eSIMs. It's because of carrier offload and Passpoint. It's all very jargony, but these are the technologies that are now all kind of came together. It's because it's very easy to do carrier or cell phone number switching from carrier to carrier, and that's getting better as well. All of those things, all those are kind of little bits that make the user experience of using something like Helium much easier to onboard and then continue to use it, right? Why does it continue to work? It's because this network is built in a way that's complementary to the existing cellular networks. And the complementary side, the people-built side of it, is significantly cheaper to operate for someone like Helium Mobile to be able to use. And so then they're able to charge you just $20 a month, right? That is a consequence of all of these things lining up, and it's a timing thing as much as it is a effort thing.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's an introductory rate or if that $20 will be able to be sustainable forever. But Brendan, I know you were telling me literally just the other day that your buddy, one of your best friends, uses Helium Mobile. And did he know? Was he a crypto guy before, or how did that all work out?
Yeah, he was. He was a crypto guy before. He's been in the space for a little while. It's not his full-time gig or anything. It's just something that he was passionate about. And he was familiar with the, typical Helium, routers that people can put in their homes. And once Helium Mobile came out, it was a conversation that me and him had about modern day cell phone plans and all this stuff is just so absurd.
Yeah, it's expensive.
And it can be. And Bryce, he's kind of in the same boat as you is. He's getting ready to have his first kid and life's getting expensive and there's all these complications. And he looked at Helium Mobile. And this was a little while back, but he looked at it and he's like, this just makes the most sense for me and my family. And so that's what he did. And he was telling me about this. It must have almost been, it felt like a year ago. But Yeah,
this is not an ad, by the way.
doing
This is
it.
not an ad. This is just,
It's
just
not
an anecdote.
just
But
a little.
I mean, I was about to say, when was the last time your cell phone carrier actually you were able to be rewarded for helping to improve the network as a subscriber?
Yeah,
Not even on the supply side.
Talk about that aspect, Scott. Talk about that aspect. That's a super interesting point that most people who are listening probably don't fully grasp the gravity of.
Yeah, and I think that it's even. I know we haven't dug in too much on the IoT network, but one of the things that's really important on kind of any of these kind of decentralized physical networks in general is the idea of how do you think about validating and verifying the network in general. And on the mobile side, the fact that the flagship demand side product, which is sitting in everybody's pocket, can participate in the network. That was something that was newer for the mobile network that we hadn't really cracked on IoT. And so how do you validate coverage? How do you ensure that coverage is there? Well, for anybody who is out there using a phone that is on the Helium mobile network, whether they're a subscriber or not, the idea that through the carrier, you're actually earning mobile tokens through the protocol because you're showing where your location is. Again, like something that you're opting into. And anonymous by design, but the idea that you can actually be rewarded for here's where I am, here's the strength of signals, that improves the network. So that's how demand side can actually kind of satisfy and improve on the supply side. Like it's very, very symbiotic in a way that I think it's something that's novel that got introduced to the mobile side. So again, just the right incentives for the network to sustain over time.
Would you say that you've seen more users on the IoT side, the mobile side? Kind of where do you see the most density of users, I guess?
Yeah, so on I mean, two very distinct things. So IoT, so I guess context there. So that when Helium launched initially in 2019, it was for the IoT or Internet of Things network, and that is think about low power, long range devices, things that are not checking email or making phone calls or streaming video. It's much more about sensors that are supporting with air quality metrics or flood detection sensors, or the most cost effective way to track some physical goods in transit. Think about vaccines going across the country. Where is it, and is it at the right temperature for storage? That was what the IoT network was always intended for. And I think that to date, it's over 100 organizations that had spun up to operate on that side of the network. So we don't actually know on a per user basis. It's more of kind of unique organizations that we see that are using the network. And there's a much broader, diverse set of use case on IoT. So again, like municipal flood detection, air quality in low income areas or construction zones. For a lot of these things in the supply chain, I just talked on those of how do you actually track those physical goods in transit in a way that is incredibly cost effective. And what we have seen with IoT is it was less about the incentives to create the supply in the last couple of years, and much more around it is an open network that is easy for people to stand up that coverage and just use it. Whereas on the mobile side of the network, that's where you're talking about less of a diversity of use cases, but something that is so comprehensible because every single one of us is carrying that use right in our pocket with our cell phones. So I think that mobile was very, very discernible for even a non-crypto audience because it's something that we all use every single day. And the idea of on the Helium mobile carrier, you've got over 100,000 signups in that. But where we're really seeing the network take off and kind of the big utility is where we have, 3 of the largest carriers offloading their, four, thank you, 4 of the largest carriers, offloading into Helium coverage. So, again, I'm not, not naming names, all these things that are named, but, again, imagine if you are a subscriber to whether it's T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, and there's not coverage, but somebody, either yourself or somebody else, has put up a Helium mobile hotspot. You're roaming into that. You don't see it. You don't know about it. But the idea that the carrier is paying in for that data offload. So again, what we were talking about at the top of the episode of how do you actually get to that kind of universal connectivity, it's with a ground up model where you don't have to see it. You don't have to understand it, but it is bringing you that utility and that benefit. Like that's the value creation right there.
To add to that a little bit, I think that on the I'll touch both again too. IoT, one way to look at it is these are just sensors that are broadcasting a very, very small amount of data, right? Like we're talking a temperature or a location. And if you look at the last week of data, like information that's out there, there are 10 million of those messages being sent over this network globally, right? That is, there's a sensor out there that is, broadcast even just one packet, and this is 10 million a day, right? So these are sensors that are actively using the network today, and that number goes up and down, oftentimes up. But I think that that's a good way to think about that network, and that network wouldn't really be useful unless there was actual ubiquitous access, right, and cheap access, right? If you're building a tracking application, let's say you're you're sending you're an e-commerce provider and you're sending a package across country, you're not going to build on Helium if it's only available in Denver, right? You're sending something to San Francisco. You're going to build it if it's available in Denver and in Utah and in Nevada and in California, right? You want to have coverage all the way through. Otherwise, you might as well just use FedEx tracking. Like that's just as good. That is the value of having a network that was built from the ground up, a brand new protocol that is truly ubiquitous. And now that we have that, especially in the United States and in Europe, we're seeing these applications just organically using it, and they don't even tell us that they're using it. It just happens, which is great. On the mobile side, kind of the idea that yes, there's 100,000 first party, like these are the Helium Mobile customers that are using this network. But then any of these other large carriers, like their customers, when there isn't connectivity, they can just use it. Like that's really powerful as well. And terabytes of data are going through this network every day now, and just automatically without the end user even understanding that. And that is really what crypto should be. Crypto should enable the cheaper, better opportunity at orders of magnitude better than what's out there, and it should be kind of seamless to the end user. Like, we as an audience are way too small. The human population is the size that we should be thinking about these things.
I'm curious, have you guys gone through any kind of growing pains? I mean, you mentioned that the Helium Mobile network has now hit the over 100,000 milestone. What kind of growing pains come with that, if any? The answer could be none, and you guys are ready to scale.
I mean, I think the focus has generally been towards the crypto audience for Helium Mobile, right? It's folks that are incentivized to earn mobile tokens from mapping. That is not a mass market audience. I think the real audience should be: do you just want a $20 a month phone plan that actually works and that actually stays at $20? It doesn't change to $60 after 3 months or whatever it is. That some other other providers have like teaser rates, right? And or they lock you in with a cheap phone or things like that. This works because phones are expensive, right? Like, do I really want to spend $1,000 a year when I go buy a new Apple phone or a whatever new Android phone, or do I want to have a cheaper phone or a free phone? But then what do I have to trade for that? I have to be locked into a carrier plan for 2 years. That's the trade-off that people often make, which is a reasonable trade-off. I don't blame them for making that choice, but that cost is not amortized very cleanly and actually is very negative for the individual.
And the goal of this isn't to create a gotcha scenario for the customer, which is a cool thing. It's like you said, there's all these sorts of crazy plans that exist in the centralized models where it's like, hey, you pay $10 a month for your first 3 months, then it goes up to $60 for the remainder of the year, and et cetera, and so forth. And then sometimes you get the really good phone with a cheap plan, or you can get the very expensive phone with a really bad plan. And there's so many variables. And I think one of the cool things about stuff like this is that there is a sense of just transparency. And it's like, hey, this is what you pay for, this is what you get, and it's straightforward. And I think that's attractive to a lot of people.
I mean, I think it's the exact opposite of a gotcha. It's a consistent, pleasant surprise in a way that translates horribly through mass market campaigns, because it's a, hey, surprise, you could be rewarded for helping to map the network. Hey, it's actually significantly harder. I don't want to say impossible, but meaningfully difficult to SIM swap because of the nature of how Helium Mobile runs. So you're talking about more security. You're talking about sense rewarding. How is it running at this cost? And that's just unpacking what community build infrastructure enables and that kind of no rent, no lease type of model. So it's just kind of one thing after another, which people need to comprehend in time. And that's one of these. It's for the marketing team to figure out how do you distill these things down to very digestible tidbits. But I think it's the exact opposite of when you don't have all of that kind of OpEx bloat that you have to account for. These things become much more cost effective to the individual.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of actually along Brendan's lines of his question about like kind of just challenges or growth. I would love like a little bit of insight just into like, did you guys always have this vision kind of since the founding of it and since the early days? Was it always to be what it is today? Or at some point, was there like a really big pivot or some kind of change that you guys could remember, a big board meeting? You're like, all right, like we're either going to take this original path we set out on, or we're going to have to go and do something different. I don't know. Is there a cool story there or anything?
I don't think there's a cool story. Like there was certainly not like any, there wasn't a meeting of the cabal or whatever, certainly that got us on this path. That wouldn't be very crypto, certainly. I think, when I started working, like Helium as a company existed for a much longer time than us as a blockchain project. And I think being a blockchain project and this kind of distribution model was the thing the company really, I think, needed to have a network at this scale. And like I think as I mentioned, like I've had this like microwave antenna on my roof for home internet, and I'm part of a wireless ISP. And one of the things I've always wondered is how does that scale nationally or globally? And there have been companies that have sort of tried to do this. There's Common Networks, which is a startup here in the Bay Area. They're trying to build like wireless ISPs and hardware for ISPs at scale. There was also there's a company called Starry out there, publicly traded company. I think the difference between those and the way that Helium the different approach that Helium decided to take, I think as a community was having that sort of, again, alignment down to the individuals, right? Like bringing more participation at the edges. And that works for a variety of things, right? It doesn't work for just IoT networks. It also works for cellular networks. And I think we're going to start seeing that for backhaul networks. There's a project out there called Dawn, and they're sort of working in that space. How do you for me, it's interesting. It's like, how do I get better internet to the actual Helium nodes themselves, right? And Dawn might be the way to do that. And there are other options as well. Like that. I think that these kinds of projects and this kind of like economic and governance model, I think makes sense for a lot of physical infrastructure. And I think that's so the moment that we started looking at cellular was really when I saw this initiative around community based cellular networks, specifically CBRS. Now, like I will say in retrospect. Phone manufacturers made it very, very hard to deploy CBRS because ultimately, like it works great as a private LTE network, right? Fantastic as one, but hybrid networks like Helium Mobile kind of expect to be able to switch between these two kinds of protocols very, very easily. But ultimately, the phone needs to support that in a real way. And we tried to do this with like a dual SIM system, but that actually creates more of a UX problem for most users. So I think that ultimately we are looking at decreasing that like UX burden, like decreasing that sort of, essentially it's an onboarding burden and technical debt ultimately, and that the end user doesn't want to deal with the technical debt.
Fascinating. And kind of like kind of going back to the original thought that I had about this big pivot or whatever. Definitely didn't want to imply that there was a cabal making decisions. But I guess it is a good point. Like how do decisions get made across the Helium network? How do you guys coordinate? Are there areas where people can go with their Helium tokens and vote or stake or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's been really excited about the community in general is how actively involved people are. If anybody jumps into Helium Discord, you will quickly see that there is dozens of folks who are constantly engaged in conversations. Every single proposal, you'll see a lot of the similar names are just like actively involved. They're not necessarily members of any Helium full-time team. They're just they're invested in the network. They want to see it succeed and grow. So yeah, we have had. God, where are we up to now on the hips? Like, what are we? 135, 136 different proposals that have come in. And some of these come in from core devs. Some of them have come in from kind of Nova Labs or other kind of commercial operators. A lot just come in directly from the community. So it's a lot of active discussion that we run through. Everything for the last couple of years has been an on-chain vote with strong community participation. So we really try, and it comes with it's the positives and negatives of building in the public. We had a lot of active and healthy discourse around things. There are stuff that core devs have put out that we've kind of changed tack on, and there are things that have come from the community that we've accelerated on. But always the issue of kind of doing any of these things in public is just the fact of you also have to kind of manage that sentiment and making sure we can distill down what can become just days and days of back scroll into what are the most important points that the broader community needs to understand and what are the implications for different stakeholders. I think that's a thing that's tougher in network governance in general is making sure you can constantly refresh that context for your largest engaged audience without forcing somebody into a Discord channel that is just pages on pages of back scroll to get in. But it's a testament to how strong the community is, but at the same time, it's always the onus on us to help everybody else kind of keep up and make sure that kind of lowest common context is broadly understood.
Well, gentlemen, we love to hear what's going on, especially when it comes to the DPIN space. But before we let you go here, what is happening next for Helium?
So I'll say a couple of things around the protocol side. Maybe Scott can talk a little bit about kind of things around the IoT and mobile side, and we'll sort of wrap it up with that. On the protocol side, there have been one of the things that I've been spending a lot of my time on is how does the protocol scale? How does governance scale? How do the economics of the network scale? We've been around for many years in the sort of crypto timeline, certainly been through several cycles as well. And we're here and we continue to be here and we'll continue to be here, I think, for a long time. And I think, some of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we, really continue to support the size of network that I think we need to support. Scott kind of alluded to this with governance, but a single user who is deploying a hotspot, it's hard for them to really keep track of every single HIP, and maybe they shouldn't really. A HIP is a Helium improvement proposal, and maybe they shouldn't be really like that active. They just want to know that they're providing value to this network and they're being rewarded for the real traffic that's going over their network. And so that's really what we've been spending a lot of our time around. We proposed a couple of very significant economic changes, and then we pared that back down once we sort of got feedback from the community, like fairly quickly. This is like awesome about our network, which is we have a bunch of very, very active people and a bunch of kind of inactive people that activate very quickly when it makes sense to do that, right? When there's a real sort of idea, request for comments out there. So I think that's what's coming next. Like we're going to continue to iterate on the sort of economic and technical design at the core of the protocol. We're continuing to sort of build into the Solana ecosystem on the governance side, and enabling other teams to use all of the sort of core infrastructure we built, and I think infrastructure not just like servers but also economic infrastructure, and allowing other people to fork and use this stuff. That's what we're doing on the kind of core protocol side.
Yeah, I would say as far as other things that come next, like one thing that I think we take pride in is relevancy, agnostic to crypto in general. So you think about the idea of we are trying to grow, large carriers are trying to grow their coverage, they're trying to support their subscribers. So how do we continue to increase on the offload side, whether that's supply side deployments, thinking about where there's existing, we kind of call this almost like a brownfield of, if you think about those towers that exist in many cities, The hardware is already there. The venues are already there. How are we thinking about just kind of loading in software that is going to be able to support that offload and continue to bring down the cost of connectivity from mobile side in general for legacy carriers as well as for Helium Mobile as a carrier itself. So that's on the mobile side. IoT, Abhay talked about where we have people who just come in and permissionlessly use the network. Whether you're talking about smart city solutions, smart ag, we want to continue to improve on that experience. Just that we can get out of anybody's way to come in and use a network that already exists and is viable. I mean, we ran some numbers on this not too long ago in terms of like percentage of population covered around the world, and truly was stunned of like how large those numbers still were. I mean, in parts of Western Europe where it's 3/4 of the country are covered, I think in the US it was like 2/3 of zip codes covered. So the idea that people can still permissionally deploy that coverage and use it, it's mostly around just how do we get out of the way and allow people to continue to build those solutions. Not to mention, we have so many commercial users on IoT, just letting them go out there, evangelize, talk about the network, and where do we just provide that educational support. So that's really top of mind for us. And then again, thinking relevancy and context. We know what's going on between Helene that just passed by, and now you've got the threat from Milton. One of the things we're thinking about as an ecosystem is how do you deploy for emergency coverage, like on the ground in that moment. So working with certain types of organizations, and kind of can't name who's who yet, but actively engaged with the types of organizations that are boots on the ground, helping to solve for local communities where, if you've got a tower that's going down, how do you create wireless on the spot, kind of in that open permissions way. So solving real social and civic problems that matter, that have absolutely nothing to do with crypto, like that's really core to, I think, a lot of the Helium DNA is making sure we're staying relevant to what that demand side needs in the world right now.
Yeah, that demand side is really interesting. I don't know if you've seen my recent tweets, but like I've been tweeting like me turning my camping gear into like my Starlink camping setup into kind of a disaster relief setup. Adding a bigger battery, putting solar on it. Like this kind of stuff does seem to resonate, and there's a tremendous amount of demand. It's actually kind of interesting. We've talked to a nonprofit recently who's like, what can you get us in a short amount of time? And we sort of threw together an idea of what we can get them. It's like, great. Can you send us 7 of those? It's like, well, I think we only have 2. It's like, I'll pay for 5 more. We just need them, right? There's demand, and turns out they actually have the capital to deploy these things and the ability, the ops to deploy these things. And so this isn't even is there someone that's willing to pay for this stuff? It's actually just like, how do you get it there at this time of need? And that is a really awesome kind of place to be in. And it actually makes me more driven to like build these things faster. Because product market fit exists, right? Like got to go faster.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's truly fascinating how all this works and how it continues to evolve. So guys, we really appreciate you hopping on. For the listeners out there who want to get plugged in, maybe they want to get on a Helium plan, or they want to get a device, or they want to learn more, where can they not only follow Helium at, but where can they follow both of you at?
I think X is probably the right answer. So the main Helium account, x.com/Helium, is great. You can follow Helium Mobile if you want to get access to a phone plan if you're based in the US. $20 a month. It uses Helium's hotspots where they are available and falls back to T-Mobile when they're not. So as the network gets built out, it'll start to use more of those hotspots. And you can use both of those to try to figure out if you want to deploy actual hardware. Like that's also an option too. Helium.com has a lot of that information on as well. My handle is just Abhay on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. This was incredible. Very comprehensive one-stop shop for all things Helium. Hopefully everybody at home enjoyed the episode. Definitely check out Helium. Follow these guys on their socials. And we'll see everybody back same time, same place next week. Thank you so much. And take care, gentlemen.